So as I think as many of you know, Min is an architectural historian based normally at Bryn Mawr College in the US. And she works in all sorts of different aspects of quantification of urban space, and will be bringing out a book called The Tyranny of the Straight Line. And this evening, she's going to be talking to us about other forms of tyranny in technology and technological tyrannies. Okay, over to you, Min.
I wanted to, since it's my only opportunity to thank you specifically, I wanted to express my appreciation for making this particular presentation possible, but also the entire fellowship. So I just appreciate so much your friendship and your solidarity through all of this. And also, I'd like to extend a thank you to Eric, who's supporting the technical side of this presentation today, and for everything that's happening next week. And most of all, I know that it's the end of the term for many of you who are listening or watching. So thank you for making the time to listen. And I really appreciate your insights and comments. So if you attended my first lecture on 19th century Paris and how a cartographic logic mediated the planning of the French capital, then you'll recognize a similar question that I want to ask of aerial photography used in French planning during the interwar period, precisely that moment when the profession of urbanism was established. And I want to ask how these images were not merely descriptive, and in some cases not descriptive at all, but generative of a profession, urban planning, an institution, the military, and also of our imaginations of what our relationship to cities are, what they can be. And I was going to focus a lot on aerial photography, but honestly, given the crises and the political violence around us erupting everywhere in Gaza and in Colombia and Myanmar, and just, I mean, it seems like a condition of life these days. I really wanted to contextualize this research on early aerial photography used for planning around what's happening to us now. Okay, so I'm going to start and share my screen. My talk is it has 4 parts. So precision is justification, blurry precision, everywhere is a battleground for photographic city. And I'm going to begin with precision as justification. So in February 2014, The Intercept, which is an online journal, they first reported that the US military's Joint Special Operations Command identified drone targets based on metadata analysis and cell phone tracking technologies. So this was developed by the National Security Agency, and one operator described that targets are linked to a specific SIM card and tracked. And drones and other aircraft are equipped with devices known as virtual base tower transceivers, which create a kind of flying cell phone tower that force a person's cell phone device to lock onto the NSA's receiver without their even knowing, right? Okay, so how does this actually work? So every cell phone network already tracks the approximate location of all phones capable of receiving calls, right? This is the basic component of the system. If the network does not know where you are, it cannot connect a cell tower and route calls or messages to your phone, right? So, however, now how the military uses this is by triangulating triangulated location information from different cell towers. A particular phone can be located more accurately. And then if you add a drone, which can do multiple flights over an area, measuring the signal and strength, it can track that phone with greater precision, as you know, we've seen with the recent arrests from the January 6th Trump riots, but that's another thing. Okay, what this means is that the US military can track a specific SIM card to within 30 feet of its actual location, feeding real-time data to teams of drone operators elsewhere who conduct missile strikes or night raids. And this geolocation system, if anyone's interested, is called Gilgamesh. The CIA also has a parallel application, and their tracking platform is called Shenanigans. And they use a pod on an aircraft, such as this one, that sweeps up actually all data from wireless routers, computers, smartphones, any electronic devices within a specific range, usually from about 4 miles in the air. So in one mission called Victory Dance, the CIA and NSA, they mapped the Wi-Fi fingerprint of every major town in Yemen with 43 flights. So in places like Yemen, Somalia, Pakistan, US intelligence agencies had none of their own informants and relied solely on these surveillance technologies for all military activity. And without the use of operatives on the ground to verify location and identity, drone operators launched strikes based on the activity and location of the mobile phone a person is believed to be using. So one operator described the NSA often located targets by analyzing activity of a SIM card rather than the actual content of the calls. And here he quotes, "People get hung up that there's a targeted list of people. It's really like we're targeting a cell phone. We're not going after people, we're going after their phones in the hopes that the person on the other end of that missile is the bad guy," end quote. So we can immediately see the evident and potential errors of this surveillance method, right, of identifying and tracking potential individuals through the proxy of a SIM card. These surveillance techniques can be thwarted by switching SIM cards with others, by moving them around to mislead the tracker. They can also be destroyed. Now, the Obama administration defended these drone warfare tactics and methods, and notably, drone strikes exponentially increased during his administration, including extending its use into new territories such as Yemen. In his speech at the National Defense University, President Obama said that, quote, "Before any strike is taken, there must be near certainty that no civilians will be killed or injured, the highest standard that we can set," end quote. He added that by narrowly targeting our actions against those who want to kill us and not the people they hide among, we are choosing the course of action least likely to result in the loss of innocent life, end quote. Okay, yet based on analyses by several independent agencies, including Human Rights Watch, Bureau of Investigative Journalism, this seems to be a statement of intention rather than actuality. And they estimate that at least 273 civilians, including children, and 2,400 people overall in Pakistan, Yemen, Somalia have been killed by unmanned aerial assaults under the Obama administration. Now, these are confirmed, right? I'm not even talking about the unconfirmed. So a recent study conducted by a US military advisor found that during a single year in Afghanistan, where the majority of drone strikes have taken place, unmanned aerial vehicles were 10 times more likely than conventional aircraft to cause civilian casualties. Okay, so in January 2012, Obama, during a kind of Google Hangout, was asked about the use of drone strikes. And he said, quote, "A lot of these strikes have been in the Fatah, or Pakistan's federally administered tribal areas. The strikes target Al-Qaeda suspects who are up in very tough terrain along the border between Afghanistan and Pakistan. For us to be able to get them in any other way would involve probably a lot more intrusive military action than the ones we're already engaging in." Now, Obama said drones had not caused a huge number of civilian casualties, adding, quote, "It's very important for everyone to understand that this thing is kept on a very tight leash." Okay, I don't want to get into this too much. We can talk about it later, but Obama here is struggling with the idea of a just war, one that minimizes civilian casualties. And we can talk about what this idea of a just war is based on. But that's the context here. Okay, so yeah, in leaked CIA records, and this is part of the huge Snowden cache, it was noted in 2011 that between 265 and 482 people were recorded in documents as killed by drones as, quote, unknown extremists, right? So they don't even know who they are, but they're labeled as such. And in 2011, the administration did not even admit to its own extensive use of drones in their military efforts. So, and there's one other issue, that in Yemen, the country that saw the greatest expansion and use of drone attacks during the Obama administration, doesn't even have a cell phone network of its own. I haven't figured that out entirely, but it's odd. Okay, so forensic architecture details in the period between 2004 and 14, domestic buildings became the most common targets, and civilian casualties increased as a result. So 61% of all drone strikes in Pakistan were targeted at houses, and they're referred to as, quote unquote, compounds in the US press, which they remark on the left. And perhaps the most famous compound was Osama bin Laden's, right? So the rhetoric around drone warfare by the administration, and of course, you know, other administrations and its Defense Department recalls the arguments made during earlier wars. Albert Wohlstetter, a prominent American nuclear strategist of the Cold War era, argued that conventional precision missiles could offer an alternative to massive nuclear destruction in the event of hostilities with a nuclear armed state. So thanks to advances in computer data gathering and transmission, missile range and yield, and offensive accuracies and reliability, precision missiles could provide an effective, quote, discriminate deterrence, end quote, Wohlstetter wrote. The logic was that precision missiles could guarantee the pinpoint destruction of enemy military targets through the globe without resorting to the nuclear option, and civilian casualties would come from nuclear war. Now, all of this was tested most evidently in the Kosovo War in 1989 and 1999. And what many military historians consider the turning point in the way that the US, NATO conducts warfare. So they used unarmed surveillance drones, real-time video transmission, and Tomahawk cruise missiles. Precision increased, the cost of wars were reduced, and the strategic advantage was maintained. So disregarding the high-profile incidents in which civilians were killed, at the time, the Secretary of Defense in the US, William Cohen, declared Kosovo to be the, quote, most precise application of air power in history. Okay, so this is all to say that I want to talk about this discourse of precision. And what strikes me about the discourse of these drone wars is that debates over its use is really based on the trust on the trust in these technologies and algorithms, and evident in the comments from the Obama administration defending its use. It is also one of the most frightening and insidious practices of spatial quantification that extends well beyond the battlefield into everyday life, blurring the line between the two. The development and use of, quote, complex mathematics, a term used in one description to explain the algorithms that identify and track targets, the belief in the technology to deliver accurate raw data, so i.e. objective, the conviction of the technology's precision through its particular visuality and real-time viewing. So that's to say that there's an iconography to these representations, as well as an important temporal quality of immediacy and simultaneity, that all of these ideas have a history, right? The geolocation technologies and the surveillance that they have allowed have a direct resonance to the adoption of new visualization technologies of an earlier era beyond the Cold War, what many historians have written about as the major tipping point in surveillance warfare. But I want to look further back, particularly to World War I, when aerial photography was first adapted and used for aerial bombing missions. And I would argue that this reoccurring rhetoric of precision is linked to the increasing physical distance between combatants that visualization technologies have allowed, its promise of precision justifies its use for war that in the end does not do what it guarantees. That is to contain military actions to a very specific area and target, but actually in the end extends war and the battlefield to encompass our everyday spaces and lives. So I'm gonna focus the rest of my talk on aerial photography and the aerial bombing that it allowed during World War I, sorry. And then I'm gonna link its consequences to urban planning and development. So drawing from Paul Virilio's writings on war and media, I argued that the use of these visualization technologies, from photography to geolocation algorithms, renders the terrain a virtual site in which the distinctions between battle, field, city, context, detail were blurred for the linked actions of destroying and planning cities and ultimately lives. Right, so blurry precision. What you're looking at is a camera that's captured an image of Fort Douaumont from April 9, 1916. This very grainy black and white image is one of the first aerial photographs used and taken during World War I. It's a vertical photograph taken from an airplane at 2,800 meters from the French attempt to recapture a key defensive structure from the Germans. So you see these pentagonal outlines of the fortress are visibly marked, and buried thin lines are etched onto the ground throughout. Pocks from artillery fire are scattered throughout the surface of the terrain, whose densities translate to white glares on the surface of the image. So the photographs of the fort in particular represent the rapid adoption of a new technology by the military. So using aerial reconnaissance, General Duval noted that aerial photography had been the eyes of the enemy and led to Allied victory. So during the entire war, aerial flight, reconnaissance, and photography were involved in every aspect of its operations. The French were foremost among the Allies and the Germans in their aerial endeavors. The Wright brothers had just taken their first flight in 1903. Soon afterwards, they set up the world's first flight school in France, in Pau, in 1909, where one could earn a license that the Aero Club de France had created. And Louis Paul Bonvillain took the first known aerial photograph from an airplane piloted by Wilbur Wright flying over Le Mans in 1909. So while the origins of mechanized flight was in the civilian sector, it was immediately taken up by the French military, setting up their own aero station at Chalet-Moudon. So most of the photographs were taken by surveying pilots called observators, and aerial images such as the ones of Fort Douaumont were shot on fragile glass plates placed in large, very cumbersome cameras that hung on the exterior of equally fragile airplanes flying very precariously over battlefields. One of the first aerial photographers, Maurice Marie Eugène Croix, first photographed German batteries at the fort in the Verdun section on October 7, 1914. And based on his aerial efforts, the French army initiated their operational aerial photographic activities, what was called the Section Photo Aérien of the Service Aéronautique within the same month. Okay, so there's a really significant point about the materiality to this media that I want to highlight. Because I think we forget this when we look at the photograph and assume that it's immediately legible. The complex mechanical, logistical, and administrative apparatus constructed for the production and use of aerial photographs belied the rhetoric of its utility that was and still is based on their universal and immediate legibility, objectivity, and precision. The seeming capacity to capture the whole situation of a given terrain and for that information to appear unmediated was compelling. And recognition of the aerial photography's tactical advantages were immediate. The French first developed a 26 centimeter focal length handheld camera with a magazine holding 12 glass plates that from 1914 was developed into 50 to 120 centimeter focal length version. So this is the ability to zoom in, zoom out, etc. And this became the mainstay of the French aerial photography. So while these images offered advantageous views of the spatial organization and context of a given site, the capabilities of the cameras had much to improve over the course of the war, and their limitations required the pilot to fly close to the terrain, risking being shot from the ground. Otherwise, to avoid attack, they would have to fly higher, but then you lose accuracy. Okay, so once the pilots landed safely, the cameras and their valuable glass plates were transported to development laboratories. This is a mobile photo lab, but they also built more fixed ones. And they were run by a team of officials, including an officer of photographs, a sergeant of drawing, a sergeant of photography, a sergeant of expeditions. Now, what I'm showing you here is a plan from the French Squadron SPA 38 stationed in Melette, and it shows you how their lab was set up. The first thing was the cameras were first broken down and separated and cleaned. That's number one. I don't know if you, oh, my cursor doesn't work, but it's marked number one there. So if any repairs were needed, they were noted. The glass plates were then separated, handled, washed, dried, treated, and that's basically numbers 4 to 7. And then they were linked to a bureau de dessin, which means an office of drawing. That's number 8. It's the largest space made available all the way to the right. And you'll also notice that a wall of maps is identified so that landmarks and significant information would be verified, identified, marked between the map and the images. Now, from there, prints were pulled on paper. That's number 8 up to 13. And then they were placed in sealed envelopes and then taken to officers in hand who were specifically trained in photographic interpretation. So often the glass plates were projected also on lantern slides, and they were discussed in the conference room, which is marked 21. And there was also an underground room in the dashed line number 23. And this was outfitted as a secondary lab in case of bombardment. So there was also the fear that these labs would then be bombed from above. So as part of this section photographique, these spaces processed all the photographs taken during the war, and at its peak in the years between 1915 and 1917, they processed about 30,000 shots from the front, making the Western Front, quote, the most scrutinized area on Earth. Okay, now, because of the poor resolution, as well as the amount of unfiltered information they presented, the images required expert interpretation. And as André Callier, a World War I photographic interpreter, wrote in his manual to aerial photography, quote, the technique of aerial photography is one of the principal sources of information, but use alone, it would never be sufficient to allow a military commander to form an opinion with absolute certainty of the intentions of the army. And so yet you have this guy who's telling you that these images are not readily legible, and yet the justifications of a war are based on that being legible. All right, so initial identification of sites were first made by the actual surveyors, right, those observators, who would verify certain landmarks and battle formations. But the photos needed extensive annotation, and officers had to be trained in reading these sensitive images. So often images were taken in array, creating a serial montage like the one you have here. And these images in particular required precise alignments that had to be compared with maps and other documentation in order for the distances and dimensions to be contextualized and verified. So for example, depending on how high the airplane is flying, right, that's going to change, and the tilt, that's going to change the angle of the photograph. So there were a series of these tables that were created to aid in calculating these distances based on the altitude of the airplane. There were also the use of stereoscopic images for three-dimensional views of the trenches, and their development as well as their use demanded training in the photographic medium, which actually was eventually required for all recruits to all sectors of the army, which I think is really incredible. Even if the images were not entirely precise, photographs as products of an objective eye were believed to be accurate. And once that belief was secure, right, the image and its information became mobile and could stand in for the terrain. And paradoxically, the very realism of the photograph allowed for a, quote, growing derealization of military engagement, end quote. And that's from Paul Virilio. So in other words, commands could be made and were made outside the direct battlefield based on reconnaissance information, and war became mediated through images. As Paul Virilio writes, war became virtual. Now, these aerial capabilities paradigmatically changed the theater of war. So beyond photographic reconnaissance and observation, the tactical value of flight was that airplanes reduced the geographic and temporal distance between enemies, while simultaneously reducing the possibility for human contact. Thus, the target from this high altitude was not the individual soldier. Peter Sloterdijk has pointed out in his text, Terror from the Air, the aerial view changed the main target of war so that it's no longer, quote, no longer the body, but the enemy's environment. And he's recalling trench warfare here. So as visible objects, cities became the front line of military engagements with aerial warfare. And the long-standing distinctions between a legitimate military and an immune non-military target collapsed. The battlefield as a contained and demarcated line of trenches with shots thrown horizontally, expanded volumetrically in space with the potential of bombs dropping vertically. And in this way, flight became both part of a defensive and offensive strategy. Through aerial reconnaissance, commanders could plot and plan maneuvers. Through aerial bombing, these same commanders could execute those plans. Okay, everywhere is a battleground. In describing the, well, I'll get to this image in a second. So in describing the requirements of these photographic interpreters, Carlier, the same, from the same manual, said that architects would probably be the most qualified. These skilled personnel were inclined to be able to connect, quote, visible topographical information with invisible knowledge, end quote. So yet, aerial photography did not offer a radically new paradigm of vision for urban planning. Right? Its immediate adoption into this nascent profession was due to the epistemological ground already cultivated with a history of using totalizing views. The emergent field of urbanism was ideologically ripe for the visuality offered by this aerial imagery, its advocacy of the necessity for drawing master plans as a scientific practice, and thus potentially more capable of resolving national issues, eased the incorporation of these images. And the people associated with the Musée Social, so this was the group that eventually would found this profession, and their particular understanding of urbanism as a brand of social paternalism, combined with socio-scientific practices into their urban plans and urban analyses. Ultimately, it secured urban planning as a technocratic practice, and one that found its clearest realization abroad and in the French colonies, using visual compositions borrowed directly from World War I photography. So Carly's specific mention of architects was not entirely random. Many young men who had been trained as architects and engineers found themselves in the trenches on the Western Front, and many soldiers assigned to aerial operations found work after the war for geographers, archaeologists, and planners. I should say that there's an amazing literature about aerial photography, World War I, and archaeology that I'm not even touching on here. Moreover, with military officers having held administrative posts, many of them in the colonies, directly overseeing planning activities before and after the war, the communication among architects, engineers, and the military was really fluid at this time. Now, among the most influential was Hubert Lyautey, the resident general of French Morocco, who was one of the first members of the Société Française des Architectes Urbanistes, founded in 1911. And this is what many consider the kind of founding of the profession, at least in France. The members of this association would be the primary agents involved in the reconstruction of many cities in France and in the colonies during the interwar years, as well as the post-war period. Now, for Morocco specifically, urban planning programs were controlled by what was a document called the Plan Directeur. This was a master plan comprised of a series of urban maps that would organize the various layers of development, mostly infrastructure. They were totalizing their authority dominant, setting all the standards and norms to which the existing city had to conform. Now, there was a book that combined all of the policies, I guess, and actions and activities that surveyed of all of these colonies, and it was by a man named Jean Royer, and these are pages that were taken out from this book called L'urbanisme aux colonies et dans les pays tropicaux, so urbanism of the colonies in the tropical countries from 1932. And Jean Royer eventually founded the journal Urbanism in that same year with a man named Henri Prost, who was Lyautey's right-hand man in Morocco. And what this particular section, but all sections do, is provide a survey of Prost's urban planning efforts from 1914 to 1923. Now, aerial views and photographs were used extensively throughout the whole book to illustrate and justify the priorities of his work in the French protectorate, including an aerial view of Casablanca from the harbor. There's another, so this is just a comparison here. There's another aerial photograph nostalgically labeled a bird's eye view of Val d'Oiseau, of Fez, with the new boulevard centered and heading in the direction of the mountains pictured in the background. But you can see these images are actually very clear. You have an aerial view taken from high altitude of a quote unquote new indigenous town that was built. And what I really think is incredible is an aerial photograph of the new Medina, showing the gridded and ordered habitations. So this new Medina was planned and built between 1918 and 1919 and was a model of urban study for these urbanists. And it was an attempt to synthesize the objectives that Lyautey had originally set out. Prost directed a project that was incredibly formalist in its approach. It decomposed and objectified architecture at scales from town to wall into very formal and typological components. He then reconfigured and composed them into new towns, and his neighborhood and his team built an entire neighborhood with all of the normative services, markets, courtyards, schools, mosques, within an envelope of white. So if the color brought shifting historical valences, and Jean-Louis Kahn has written about this, so these valences from the Muslim Orient in the French imaginary to the hygienic modernity in Prost's execution, then in the photographs, this white represented visibility. So unlike the Casbah in Algiers, which was very famously visually impenetrable, right? You have here the visually penetrable, newly planned colonial city. Okay, so the photographic scene. So the distant aerial view, while offering the synoptic, could not offer precise detail. The quality of the photograph was relatively poor. Their transfer to prints and then paper reproductions only reduced that clarity. At the beginning of the war, the low resolution capacity of the technology was at odds with the rhetoric of photography's unparalleled accuracy and precision. And accordingly, the necessity of these interpreters skilled in deciphering these blurry forms conveyed the camera's limitation. This limitation, however, while problematic for offensive action during the war, or in some cases not, right, was actually a really important factor for defensive strategies. Now, the advent of mechanized flight had actually preceded imagined aerial bombings. So one early example is from 1670, where this monk, Francesco Lana, fantasized of an aerial ship that could create many disturbances in the civil and political governments of mankind, end quote. And the fear of attack from above was so terrifying that Victor Hugo in 1862, he imagined that aircrafts would compel a universal abolition of international borders and eventually lead to great world peace. What an optimist. While many were optimistic of aerial technology's consequences, they all relied on the clear awareness that aerial war meant a new kind of terror. And as military historians agree, the principal objective of aerial warfare during the world wars was to induce fear in people on the ground from an invisible enemy from above. Another optimist, Le Corbusier, ever fascinated with aerial flight, would reflect, quote, "Then came a day when offensive weapons made a mock of military enclosures, when the advent of the airplane meant that fortresses no longer had ceilings, a recent event since its dates from the First World War." Okay, so a new terrain had become open, that of the skies above cities, an atmospheric terrain in which attackers had unrestricted freedom of movement and selection of targets, while the targets, cities, and its inhabitants were immobile and effectively defenseless. The only defense that cities had against aerial reconnaissance and bombing was what? Photographic concealment. So French cities that were vulnerable to German aerial attack devised really earthly solutions, camouflage nets. Web-like textiles were shaped with raffia, hay, branches, all manner of material to mimic the flora of the locale, stretching like vines along and across the urban terrain. So from 1916 to 1970, these nets that you see here in the photograph, produced by the French camouflage section, were hung across beams to cover streets, buildings, and all manner of objects extending to about 7 million square yards. There were also observation posts that were disguised as tree stumps. From the plain, the graphic patterns of these nets became territorial patterns of fields, brush, and forest. And historian Hannah Rose Schell argues in this wonderful book called Hide and Seek, this type of serial camouflage was a response specifically to the camera and historically defined by practices to circumnavigate the aerial technologies developed during that First World War. These practices constitute a politics of resolution, referring to Virilio's idea of the, quote, regulation of points of view, who argued that the battles of World War I were as much about the violent battle between the ground perspective and the aerial one enabled by reconnaissance aircraft. Now, considerations of a city's vulnerabilities against aerial reconnaissance and attack were at the forefront of the French army throughout the war, as bombings of towns and villages throughout the country left many of them decimated in ruin. While urbanists, architects, academics, politicians, as well as the military were debating the terms of urban reconstruction, a creative defense proposal was submitted to prevent any further and future aerial attack against the most important French city, Paris. So on 29 January 1916, a German Zeppelin had launched 16 bombs onto eastern Paris, causing the deaths of 26 people in the districts of Belleville and Ménilmontant. While the Germans had used maps and photography to identify and launch targets, the French press in their reportage were ironically not permitted to map or photograph the locations and the extent of the bombings. So between 1914 and 1918, about 275 Parisians died and close to 1,500 were wounded in 24 air raids and 3 Zeppelin attacks. These German attacks on Paris, paired with the night raids on London from the 19th to the 20th November of 1917, created incredible urgency to develop anti-aircraft urban defense systems that included projectiles, anti-aircraft guns, and the improbable idea to camouflage the French capital. So just before the end of the war, in 1918, Fernand Jacopozzi, a Florentine electrical engineer who is better known for having illuminated the Eiffel Tower for the exhibition of decorative arts in 1925, he proposed the creation of a, quote, faux Paris, using illuminated decoys of the city's major landmarks. The French government ran with the idea and called upon industry to design and execute its building. The first step was to find a location that could fool these pilots. The discussion of potential sites was centered around nocturnal visibility from the air. So from 1917, after 1917, daytime aerial bombing missions were discontinued with anti-aircraft defense systems on both sides. So pilots had to fly at night without radar and navigate by moonlight, relying on natural landmarks such as rivers and built forms such as towers and roads. And so in the end, 3 sites were selected: a site north of Paris where the curve of the Seine River resembled its course through the capital, and 2, another northeast of Paris that would mimic the rail lines returning to Gare du Nord and Gare de l'Est and replicate the buildings of Saint-Denis and also the factories of Aubervilliers. And then the 3rd site to the east of the city, simulating, those industrial zones of Chelles, Ornay, Vers-sur-Marne, Champs, etc. So this was meant to be a city of simulacra, made for aerial vision to be destroyed by aerial attack. Described in L'Illustration, which was a popular journal, after the project had been canceled, the project was scenographic. They write, all we could do was set up a few lamps alongside the dirt roads so as to give the impression of avenues where the lights hadn't been turned out. Moreover, using tactics like nets deployed in other French towns, simulating the rail tracks was done by just placing canvases on the ground. So these structures, just to give you an idea of how kind of absurd this was. So new structures were built, including buildings, platforms, trains, and these wooden buildings were then enveloped with painted canvases where they were stretched and translucent, so to imitate the kind of the dirty glass roofs of the factories. In the end, faux Paris was never tested. Construction was completed only after September 8, 1918, and the November armistice put an end to the entire project. I think the plans, though, speak to how fully a culture of aerial visuality had pervaded government actions that intertwined urbanism and military defense. And it was not merely that military commanders and urban planners functioned in a world of simulations, a virtual, but they also built them. Okay, so what we see from this brief history that I've outlined, and maybe I've been speaking too long, is that significantly aerial photography did not necessarily provide greater vision, right? This seems obvious. The details of cities remained largely illegible due to the poor resolution of these aerial views, alluding to destructive military results as well as potential defensive strategies. Regarding the urban planning efforts in the colonies, which I only really briefly touched on, the consequences were devastating on many fronts. For urban programs in Morocco, it led to policies of segregation and isolation that were well pictured, but not well lived for the local population. Aerial photography, while providing the overview, created a sense of distance that ultimately evacuated the image of any accountability to the colonial subjects, while at the same time seeming to provide solutions that were precise to the terrain. For the French defense against the Germans, the lack of visibility was used as an advantage in concealment. Towns and urban areas were camouflaged and built for the camera and the aerial photograph. It was precisely this sense of distance that allowed for the army to create with precision an inaccurate terrestrial image. In these cases, but perhaps especially with the current drone wars, the terrain is rendered a virtual site in which these distinctions between context, detail, between civilians and soldiers, between battlefield and not, are manipulated or interpreted, let's say, for these linked actions of destroying and planning cities. So in conclusion, I just want to take a moment to connect my thoughts presented with the larger theme of the quantification of urban space program that I've been organizing for these past few months. So this topic was an outgrowth of my work on 19th century urban planning in France, especially in Paris, where architects and engineers and administrators began to rely solely on a specific kind of image or map to construct cities. And this was an image that was born out of a growing appreciation of numbers, of mathematics, of quantification. So the Banister Fletcher program, allowed me to organize, and was a means for me to take this question further and ask experts and scholars what it means to quantify, how we quantify. And the first panel and conversation and workshop was really addressed to those issues. So next week, when we have the second panel, conversation and workshop, those will address what the consequences of quantification, mensuration, algorithmic mapping, and the images that emerge from these techniques have on our environments, on our urban environments. So how do these methods inform our cities, our imaginations about shared spaces? And so we have a really wonderful interdisciplinary group of scholars, including a demographer, a sociologist, a landscape architect, and historians, to discuss some of these issues about scale, risk, speculation, among other issues. As for the workshop, I've invited Andre Dufour, who's the head of location services at Amazon. He's not an academic, but he's actually developing these technologies, to dialogue with ULIP's very own Egan Eisen, to discuss the mapping applications that are being developed now for businesses, consumers, and what this all means for you, for our public spaces and our urban cultures. So I just want to conclude with that, and maybe one last thank you to Anna Louise and also Hannah Williams and Peg Ross, as well as also to the staff at ULIP for the opportunity to organize these events and the support that you all have given me. I'm really honored to have been a Banister Fletcher Fellow, despite himself probably having never imagined a committee of women offering a fellowship in his name to someone such as myself, working on these issues, and any of us having anything to say about architectural history. So I think it's progress on that side. But really, I want to thank you all for your insights.
It's probably the only clapping that you can hear, but that was so fascinating, and thank you so much. I think it's opened up so many questions, and I just love the way in which you've moved between contemporary visualizations and then these really interesting photos. I think that the document where you showed us how the photographic lab was set up within this strange mobile carriage, and just that way of taking apart, really inviting us to think about how these images were moved between hands and rooms and modes of interaction, washed and then put in envelopes and then handed on and then discussed in a kind of plenary session, and then potentially in a secret session, and then redrawn, and all of this manipulation to produce this so-called sort of snapshot. I mean, there are all sorts of questions that I would want to ask about this. Maybe I'm going to actually just follow on from that question as I start to see the questions coming through, and I'm going to start publishing them. So please do put your questions into the Q&A, and I'll move them over so that the whole group who's online can see them. But I think I want to just ask, perhaps slightly, displacing the question of the image, and ask a little bit about the question of language, perhaps around that idea of some of that very intrusive and militarized language that's also present within the photographic discourse. If you have something to say about the way these processes were named as well, because I think part of our big problem here is, how do we talk about these things? How do we actually bring them into the discursive sphere? So at the time in these early experiments, what was the how?
Yeah, I think you touch on something so important, which is that it was precisely the fact that these images were that they didn't offer a discourse, right? What they offered was immediacy,
Mhm.
and that was their value. It was as if you don't need words anymore. They
Right.
communicated on their own. But what I think Carlier says that's really important in his manual is that no, actually, we need these interpreters. Like they actually call them interpreters, which says something about the problem, not only of the image, but also of the discourse
Yeah.
that you're pointing out. That there was this huge gap, right? And what is also, you mentioned also the materiality of these images and the whole infrastructure that was built around it. And one thing that I think we have to remember is there's also a very important materiality to the communication that's happening now with all of these digital technologies, that there are actually planes and these pods, and there are actual missiles, and they actually do go from one hand to another. And so that needs to be considered as well, that and it's the only way to counter this rhetoric of simultaneity,
Right.
I think is really problematic.
Yeah. The other, just on in reflection of that as well, I was also really struck by that idea that the discourse would also be constantly tending towards or trying to tend towards forms of protocols, so manuals, manipulations, a kind of standardization as well of the sorts of ways in which these, so that thing you showed us where the image needs to be read with these different sorts of rescaling of it, that struck me as being incredibly relevant to how the sorts of processing that happens today to images in order these kind of automatically inscribed modes of correction in order to bring the image into the frame of some sort of utility, which is really, really interesting.
Yeah, I'm just reading Raquel's comment. Yeah, of course.
I'm going to push them all over here. So there was one from Robin as well. And then there's one about Rakedi as well, from Rakedi, yes, saying, isn't immediacy also discourse?
Of course, yeah, that's exactly the point. And you see, I mean, when I was reading about the drone warfare, I was just so struck by how similar the discourse is and how the immediacy was such an important value. And that so much rested upon the immediacy. So now you can watch in real, I mean, I remember in the Gulf War, right, when I think we all do, the Gulf War, watching that on television and I remember just being stunned by what I was seeing. There was that first televised, live military action. And so that image of Obama's defense team sitting around there watching the killing of America's number 1 enemy, it's just so important that's part of that discourse that Raquel is pointing us to.
No, there are some other questions there as well. I think I want to just before, as I'm kind of taking stock over them as well, just bring back that idea, which comes particularly out in my experience, in any case, out of analysis of some of the images of the Second World War. So not so much the First World War, but this idea that there would be something dangerous about these images, that they petrify the imagination, is the way Claude Lanzmann in particular talks about the use of images. And I just wonder if you want to say something for some of the people as well listening. This is a topic we've discussed a fair bit with the students, and there may be some who are part of this call or this event. How would you talk about the capacity, how you work with images to be able to bring alive these social relations operating around them? I mean, it seems to me that you are making the images active, and what is your processes in doing that? What is in a way, what happens when you are looking for the image that you're going to be able to make move and show us how social relations are configured around it?
It's such a big question. Thanks, Emily. First off, I would never, I mean, Claude Lanzmann, I'm assuming you're referring to Shoah.
Yeah.
It's, I mean, the debates around that and his work, which I'm not really a scholar of and know only tangentially, is that for him, that, you know, the horror could not be imageable. And I think what was really important about the debate that came out of that his work and that statement, and Georges Didi Uberman's response to that, as saying, but you know, there's still those images that were taken. You know, how do we account for them? I think in these cases, I mean, I don't have such terrorizing images, like, so they don't. The scale is not different. That is so different. The content and the context of these are so different. I mean, all of the images that I showed were in fact official military photographs. They were not meant to record something that wasn't meant to be recorded, that shouldn't have been recorded. And it doesn't have the same effective value, I think, because of their official status. However, many of the photographs, especially taken by the aerial photographers who eventually became urban planners or planners who used aerial photography, what you see when they write text using those images is that they identify things in the images that, you know, maybe you know, but when you look at them, and I think this is a methodological question in a way, just look at, you know, just looking at them, you're like, well, I don't see that in there. I don't see what they're saying is in there.
Right.
And I think there's something really important to, and this is to go back to the materiality, then you really look and say, okay, well, what is this image really showing us? Maybe it's not showing us anything. And in fact, so many of these urban photographs were so blurry that unless somebody had written that text, you wouldn't know what's in them. And I think it's precisely understanding how photography works and the material process of it that makes you realize that, you know, just makes you able to read it sideways.
Right. Okay.
And to get at some of these other, I don't know if that answers the question.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, that idea, I think, again, your picture of how the photo was processed. So moving away from the photo as image to the photo as production process is an extremely interesting and productive thing to do in terms of understanding that. Yeah, let's turn to the questions here. So there's a question here about from Nigel asking about the relation between the faux Paris defences and the metros that were transformed into shelters. And so this idea of some sort of transformation of the everyday urban environment, the extension of the battlefield, I think, and how whether you think these things in relation to one another.
Yeah, I think they're absolutely related. And yeah, you're right that there was no radar available in World War I. I don't know, did I say that? I didn't mean, if I said that, I didn't mean to say that. You're absolutely right. And so that allowed for all these other, these, in some ways, I think like very scenographic, almost, I find them somehow really imaginative and artistic. There's an aesthetic to it that I find really compelling personally, but they're part of all of these underground, let's say in this case, the metros, ways of hiding, right? So they were the ready bunkers that became really important, especially after World War II. But so what was visible was concealed, and what could be, you know, and if you could hide, there were all of these places that could be hidden. I think that they were very much connected.
Right. Okay. And then there's also a question about was there also a soft impact in art and architecture? So
what does that mean? Can I ask for clarification from Robin?
Maybe, well, clarification is perhaps posted into the chat, and then I can feed it on. Okay. Robin, if you'd like to post some clarification on what you mean by a soft impact. I'm going to ask whether or not, because I'm sort of aware of there being already, I think for Walter Benjamin, that opposition between the route on the land, the walked road versus the aerial perspective, which will obviously become so important, and we can find it again later in the work of de Certeau, would be an obvious person to think of in terms of that long trajectory of a sort of poetics of urban perambulation and the walking rather than the mapping. And so I wonder whether or not, yeah, maybe it's also picking up on the question that Robin's asking about a sort of another alternatives to this very powerful intersection of the military, the planning, and the architectural and the photographic perception of the city that you've told us about. Is the were the resistant forms of thinking the urban, and what spaces did they emerge from in this period?
I think that the trajectory that you're pointing to, Anna Louise, is precisely what comes out in the post-war, the World War II, the post-war period, post-World War II, I mean. But it wasn't evident, or at least among the architects during the interwar period going in, it wasn't really evident, partly because they were so ensconced in the military. I mean, coming out of, they had dual training, right? In especially if you were a civil engineer and you went to the École des Ponts et Chaussées, or you went to the Polytechnique, or if you were a soldier and then you had training through the army, and then your skills became really useful for colonial projects, not just in Morocco, but actually most particular in the Levant, or the French Levant, when the French gained all of the Ottoman provinces, and the French actually did not have anyone on the ground in that, and the Ottomans took all of their maps with them when they left. And so the French they only had the option of flying. And so it became a symbiotic relationship between architects, urbanists, and the military, or military trained surveyors to go through. So in terms of their training, in terms of their perspective, they were really close. I mean, it's really hard to separate it out. I think you really start to see critical discourses within the field of urban planning and architecture, and then more generally in critiques, in historians, scholars in after World War II. And I think because the horrors of the potentials of nuclear warfare were so incredible.
Okay, so Robin has clarified a little bit. I just meant if we could see the outcome from this, since so many people were involved as soldiers, at least in the training they went through that you mentioned.
Oh,
so the training.
Yeah, actually, I mean, I don't even, for me, like Le Corbusier, I put that in because everyone is, I mean, he's so well known, but most of the people who were using this, and this is really the establishment of a normative professional class and practice of urbanists, the very first urbanists starting from 1911 when the profession was supposedly founded. I mean, that really is the primary kind of normative role of these aerial views, military training, and colonial projects, and then planning. I mean, Corbusier's interest in, I think, the airplane and the aerial view comes out of, obviously not at all from any military training, but simply a fascination, almost an avant-garde, kind of avant-garde take on it. But there was a very strong normative, I don't want to say standard, but a normative part of urbanist culture from the very foundation of the profession. I don't know if I'm making any sense.
I think that question about the training and how it might get sort of redeployed, I'm interested. I think it would be really interesting, and perhaps of work that's been done on this, of that training and the technical ability, and actually just the access to the camera, which does become such a tool, I think, of forms of an attempt to, in any case, cultivate spaces of political autonomy. So whether it be the Communist Party distributing cameras, or particularly I'm thinking of within the surrealist milieu. And so kind of completely out of the frame of urban planning, where I think there's a kind of, there's a rechanneling of expertise around the use of the camera and its capacities. So not within the aerial,
Right.
obviously, because without the difficult bit of the technology to access was the flight.
Right.
But actually, I just think it would be really interesting, and I wonder whether this is work you're aware of, to start to think about that perspective question. So not necessarily from sort of 25,000 feet up, but rather just from looking from the perspective above, the sort of vertical perspective, to what extent that's mobilized within other paradigms that might actually have been more contestatory of the desire to map and flatten the world into this accurate, inaccurate terrestrial image, as you say. So I thought that was a beautiful sentence.
Well, that was that's such a good point. You're right. I hadn't even really thought about it within the context of artistic practice, but when you think about Leger and among others, but also, I mean, he comes to mind, but yeah, the surrealists, and then you think in the 1960s of Guy Debord and his psychogeography. You're right that there's a whole tradition that's responding to that kind of perspective and skewing.
Yeah, I know, and I'm just wondering whether or not something about that around as well. It feels that there's a lot of work that's been done on the a work of an oppositional way of living the experience of being the ethnographer mandated by the state to go and document the colonial expansion. And so then that question of how would you kind of in some way work within the paradigms of some sort of flattening above vertical perspective in order to undermine its capacity to map the world within artistic practice, I think would be, yeah. I
mean, that's also such a relevant question for now. Please, like, how do we think of practices that subvert the surveillance that is possible with, that's occurring now?
Yeah. How do we make it work within its technological capacities to other ends? Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah. Okay. Hey, we have another comment here from Robin, which I have just posted. Could we see it in architecture beyond Corbu and other forms of architecture and other artworks, or even in art school training? I think that's the sort of thing we're discussing, in fact, really.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I'm reading this other question that's come in as well.
Okay, sorry, yes, another one here, yes, which not everybody can see, but now this is a comment from Tom Ridgway.
Oh yes, that's right. In Tripoli and Libya, yeah. I mean, what is really interesting about that was it didn't create like massive significant damage, let's say, but it was the capacity to do that was so frightening that that many militaries, namely the Austrians, became really started developing defensive systems precisely against that, with that test bombing in Libya by the Italians.
So I think what I feel as I'm sort of listening to this, and I think it's just, again, really important to think about where we're at now and to think about what you're offering next week in terms of the panel conversation, and particularly the workshop, is that I'm allowing myself the realization of the extent to which the technological capacity dictates really the way in which it is lived on the ground, kind of really quite literally. So the ground adapts to the technological capacity, and people start reshaping the city, cloaking it, clothing it, living it differently, and not just through the actual planning of the process. So the extremities of that is Casablanca, where the Medina has to start being in these little box spaces, and it actually gets built. But the kind of terrifying thing is that even in the more established urban environment, where there might be forms of sort of infrastructures of resistance, there is a willing adoption of this virtual projection, which is, I think, what you showed so well in this kind of remaking as a simulacrum of the city in order to correspond to a projected virtual image.
Right, which is exactly what also happened in 19th century Paris, when the city was essentially flattened to conform to the constraints of the map. Right, they leveled streets so that it could be planar, flat, to meet the flatness of the plan itself that had no altitudes on it, etc., so that those things, that image and the worlds, could conform to each other.
Yeah.
So that, and I don't think it's necessary. I mean, these are really intentional cases, right, where you have these huge infrastructural projects that are built with the intention to respond to some technical capacity or capability. But you're absolutely right, Annalise, that there are really unintentional ways that we are adapting ourselves and conforming our behaviors to meet the framework that is dictated by a certain technology. I mean, I just think how, this is maybe a stupid example, but I remember when navigational systems first came out, and I remember how the way in which it navigates you, which is through this, it's like as if you're driving on a street and the video is like a virtual street. I remember thinking how I couldn't read it. I'm so used to opening that map, the road map, and thinking, okay, first I have to get to this city, then to that city, and that those are my landmarks. You just follow the sign through the cities. But now with the navigation systems, I don't remember the old way of doing that. I've gotten so used to navigating my world through Google Maps or whatever that it's very hard for me to go back and use the old maps. And the road systems still rely, the signage on highways when you're traveling through France, they still rely on you knowing the old map system. First you head to Montpellier, then you go to, whatever, then you and then eventually the signs from Paris start to appear, and then you're on the right track. But Google Maps never uses those signs. They use the weird numbers that nobody knows in France, like the A32 or whatever. And so I just start to wonder, when is that signage going to change so that we navigate, the navigation system that's on our cars is now conforms to the signage on the highway. I don't know. This is just a subtle.
Yeah, and also, I mean, I think we go one step further than that and say, when does that become the quantification of space also become the kind of quantification or the transforming into linearity of time? It seems to me that, I mean, again, I'm not very good at using those sorts of navigation systems because I have to think, my brain is conditioned to try and think distance between points and to want to have it be measurable. But then what I encounter in these sorts of apps is it'll take 13 minutes. Or it'll take 26 minutes. And it's constantly changing as well, because of course, if I get a bit later, suddenly it's not taking 13 minutes, it's taking 14 minutes, but that's still given to me, offered to me as a sort of absolute measurement of that stage of the journey. So it's this combination of the constantly changing data that's being sucked and processed and returned to me without me having any knowledge of that process going on really, but it's presenting itself to me as something that looks stable. Between point A and point B on my app, it's 14 minutes. Right. And I think that's a really sort of extraordinary sort of job, not just the quantification of urban space, but the quantification in that sense of the movement through it as well, as time becomes these digits for us.
And I don't know if I'm pronouncing, but Wolfgang Swivelbusch writes about this. When time became a standard, regular, the railway time, what you're talking about, I think it's so fascinating. You're right.
Yeah.
Different ways in which we're measuring space.
Yeah, and even if we try and operate our own inertia in that kind of Luddite way of saying, I'm just going to walk really slowly, actually the machine already knows that my answer to that is to walk really slowly, and it adjusts for my own. So it's that thing about, you know, again, this is, I don't know if a couple of the students who are working on projects very directly related to this. It seems to me that makes, if we go right back to even my embodied experience of trying to walk, like, so that opposition that's so sort of determinate in a lot of thinking about how we form our resistances within the city. We can think of a whole swathe of really sort of quite enchanting or potentially re-enchanting literature, which anchors it in that idea of the subject, embodied subject, moving through the space of the city in a kind of poetic wandering mode. It's such a kind of topos within sort of Parisian thinking, particularly of space. But actually, you know, today I'm not sure that I have any means, in fact, of operating through as a resistant body within that space. So long as I am also orienting myself through my phone. It's my body has become, to some extent, that phone.
Well, I mean, I think that this topic is exactly one of the issues that will be raised in the workshop with Andre Dufour, and the applications and platforms, the mapping and geolocation applications that are being developed by Amazon. You know, what goes into thinking about and producing these programs for consumers, for businesses.
Yeah, I think the key thing is to be on different networks, because then you get, like, if you're walking alongside somebody who's working from a different network, then it doesn't sync. And then all of a sudden, like, the reality of us in space actually looking at one another with some sort of
things that don't sync up, that precisely don't line up.
It's those little spaces. Okay, anyway. But I think probably everybody else has had enough of our conversation, and I think this is the time to encourage, because I don't see any more questions arriving here. And I think this has been a really fascinating talk, and really sets up this next stage as well for the conversations. I know that a number of the people who you've got joining next week on Tuesday are very interested in these sorts of questions of how we imagine our spaces of resistance, inertia, and an alternative to this massive mapping and quantifying of our experience in the urban frame and beyond. As you say very rightly, the battlefield has no limits, and the urban, perhaps in that respect, if the urban is the quantifiable, also has no limits, really. So the encouragement to everybody still on the call to join next week. Thank you so much again, Min, and have a good evening, a good afternoon, and yeah, here is moments of thoughts of everybody around the world in keeping safe, keeping calm, keeping abreast of everything that's happening as well.